Okay, we continue the rest of the way in this lecture, in this unit. We're going to be talking about slavery and the slave trade, a somber topic, to put it mildly, since we're talking about an inherently evil institution, which lasted for hundreds of years, excuse me. And we'll be talking about African slavery, specifically, not ancient slavery in the Mediterranean world or slavery in other parts of the world. And it's difficult to talk about, read about, learn about these subjects, but as I'm sure you know by now, history is full of depressing topics. So this won't be the last. We're going to have to study the evils of Nazi Germany eventually, and communist China, and so this won't be our last look at something that's quite ugly in our history or in world history, quite sometimes horrifying to have to learn about. Nonetheless, it's important to understand these subjects and topics, I think for obvious reasons, because we want to understand how such evils can occur in a world that we want to be civilized, and we want to become more civilized and advanced in the future. So I think I read this quote at the end of last time, but I'll read it again. We're starting to talk about the Atlantic slave trade, and we'll get to the triangular trade, which you can already see on the map there, but I have a separate slide. Of all the processes that linked Africa to the larger Atlantic world in early modern times, the most momentous was the Atlantic slave trade. From the 15th to the 19th century, European peoples looked to Africa as a source of labor for sprawling plantations that they established in the Western Hemisphere. In exchange for slaves, African peoples received European manufactured products. And we already did talk about that somewhat. I think it comes up more as we get into more details about slavery itself. The Atlantic system, or the aforementioned triangular trade, this is a more simple map, but this was the center of the world economy by the time we get to, say, 1650, certainly 1750. Remember from one of our earlier units, before circa 1500, the center of the world economy was in the Indian Ocean in Asia. And it's partly because of the discovery of the Americas, which you see in the blue, at least those parts of the Americas that are part of this triangular trade, and the importation and use of slave labor in the Americas from Africa, which you see in the red, which became the driving force, or one of the major driving forces, that made the Atlantic world, which you see here, with Europe as the other corner of the triangle, the center of the world economy. So the triangular trade or the Atlantic system, they mean the same thing. We can see, and maybe should see, as a gigantic engine of economic growth and wealth production, with slavery and the slave trade as a central feature. The ghastly inhumanities of the slave trade, and they are many. We don't have time to do justice to all of the cruelties. Maybe that's a good thing, but we do need to deal with it to some degree. Ulada Equiano, a remarkable figure in history, more on him later on too, who was a slave, escaped slavery, and had a remarkable life and career after that. But he actually went through a lot of these processes, including the Middle Passage voyage, taking Africans against their will, of course, to the New World. He said of this type of ship and voyage, the shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole scene of horror almost inconceivable, from one of the books that he later wrote. You see, just to pick those things on the screen here as examples. We won't go into further detail, but among the other inhumanities and just sheer barbarism, and utter cruelty, savagery. In the upper right, we see slave sort of inspections. Slaves. This is in America, the U.S. These pictures. So slavery in the southern states primarily, but slaves were considered and were legal property. So by law, they were property, human beings as property, and because of that, then they could be treated like property. And what you see depicted in the drawing on the upper right is a slave that's being offered for sale, and potential purchaser of that slave inspecting them like one might expect cattle or something. So slaves were legally no different than cattle, which tells you a great deal just in that one little picture and story about it, about how evil this institution was. In the lower right, however, there's something that equals it, and that is a picture of a slave auction. Slaves were often auctioned off, much like a modern auction today, and to add insult to injury here, and this is depicted also here, we see slaves regularly in the Americas sold away from their family members. They might have come over on the voyage, again against their will, but a whole family might have been scooped up and coerced, forced onto a ship. But once they got to the other side, depending on what the economic needs of the purchasers, the plantation owners, slave owners were, they might buy a son and a daughter away from the mother, or mother and father, and they'd never see each other again, ever, ever, ever. And on the left, you see a drawing done during the abolitionist movement by one of the English abolitionists fighting to end slavery, trying to diagram just how inhumane the conditions were aboard slave ships. What you see there is sort of an example of how closely packed slaves were under the decks, on their beds, if you can call them that. They were bunks, but with like boards, and often, usually chained down or tied down in one form or another. But that's actually pretty accurate, but it was drawn in order to give people in England and Europe a sense of how awful and how brutal this all was. And it certainly was that. Getting even worse here for us, and by all means, if you don't want to watch this or listen to this, fast forward ahead a little bit. But the infamous middle passage comes next, and I'm going to read from von Sciver's book, one of my go-to books in this class so far. Because the profits involved in transportation were so high for captains, officers, and even crewmen, meaning the crew of the slave ships themselves, white Europeans, they constantly experimented with ways to pack the maximum number of human beings into the holds of their ships. Because a certain percentage of mortality was expected during a voyage that lasted from a week to nearly 2 months, some ship captains favored tight packing, meaning deliberate overcrowding on the assumption that a few more might survive than normal. On the other hand, some captives favored the loose pack method, with the assumptions that a higher percentage would survive if given marginally more room than normal. In either case, conditions were abominable, and slaves that died were just dumped overboard without any funeral, any kind of pretense at any burial at all. Von Sciver goes on to write, the holds of ships were locked and barred, and the hatchways and vents covered with iron gratings. The slaves were chained to tiny bunks, arranged in tiers, configured to maximize the space of the hold, which you saw in the diagram in the previous slide. Food was minimal, usually corn mush, and sanitation non-existent. The small groups of captives would be brought up on deck on a rotating basis to be haphazardly washed of their vomit and feces with buckets of frigid ocean water thrown at them by the crew. It's hard to describe this in your own words without getting sick to your stomach over it. But again, this is humanity shrinking to the lowest levels of barbarity and sadistic cruelty. About 25% of slaves did not survive the voyage. As far as the impact of the slave trade long term on Africa is concerned, about, and this is an estimate, but about 16 million were abducted from Africa between 1500 and 1800. This is in the transatlantic slave trade. We'll talk about the Muslim slave trade in a while here too. So 16 million just sort of from this side of Africa moving west across the Atlantic. Sometimes it was as many as 80,000 to 100,000 slaves taken to the New World a year. That's kind of that's the high end year, but it was always in the multiple thousands, at least by 1700 and beyond. It changed demographic and social patterns considerably in Africa. So some family arrangements and marriage, polygamy, things like that, are at least in part a product of the depleted population of Africa from the slave trade. Increased violence. This caused all kinds of disruptions and conflicts within African society because it often pitted Africans against each other. What Europeans would do, the Portuguese slave traders, Spanish, later the Dutch, the English, etc., is they would find an African group. I think I mentioned this once in the early part of the lecture, but it bears repeating. They'd find a group that they'd make a deal with and say, look, we'll provide you with manufactured goods, including guns, if you provide us with slaves. And if the deal was struck, the African group in one particular area would use the guns to go and capture by under the point of a gun and force them back. But they of course would go to another tribe or another group in order to get slaves. They wouldn't take them, of course, from their own group. So it pitted one village, one group, one tribe against another, and it faced African peoples with no good choices or options, none, because they could say no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to enslave fellow Africans, and some tribes would do that. But they knew that if they did, they would be faced with the possibility and maybe the real likelihood that the Europeans, say it's the Portuguese, are going to go to their neighbors and give them the same deal, and then it's going to be the group that just turned down the offer that's going to get hunted down and sold into slavery and shipped across the Atlantic, and never be able to come back. So this created a great deal of tension and stress and violence because, understandably, some groups gave in to this because they didn't want to see themselves and their kids and their families sold into slavery. So no good options here because of the cruelty of the European slave trade. The African diaspora means sort of spreading of peoples. So this is kind of the demographic pattern of the numbers that left Africa against their will and their destination. And you can see, and I'm not looking for details here, or I'd have to give you more information, but just from the number of multiple purple arrows going in many different directions, you can see how widespread this was and how large a long-term operation it was. So the African diaspora, the forced migration of millions of Africans to many places around the globe. On the east side of Africa, there are fewer arrows, but that's the Muslim slave trade that we're going to get to in a bit. On the other side, to us, this side of the Atlantic, in the Americas, most slaves were sold to plantations and plantation owners, so worked in this type of environment. Quoting from Professor Bentley, again here, our lovable author, most African slaves went to plantations in the tropical and subtropical regions of the Western Hemisphere, the Americas. Many of these plantations produced sugar, which was one of the most lucrative cash crops of early modern times. During the 17th century, tobacco rivaled sugar as a profitable product. Rice became a major plantation product, as did indigo. By the 18th century, many plantations concentrated on the cultivation of cotton, and coffee began to emerge as a plantation specialty as well. These are what were sometimes called cash crops, and this is kind of monoculture, monoagriculture, which means sort of one crop that can be grown, a lot of it on a certain piece of land, and lends itself to large labor force, or requires a large labor force to at least to make it profitable, like sugar production, which you see here. Plantations featured a sharp racial division of labor. Small numbers of European or Euro-American supervisors governed plantation affairs, and large numbers of African or African-American slaves performed most of the community's physical labor. There were other arrangements besides plantations, but plantations are where most slaves ended up because that's where the economic demand was. As far as life on slave plantations, I'm mainly using, for an example here, not completely, but mainly in this slide and going forward, life on slave plantations in the United States before the Civil War. But work was dawn to dusk, from sundown or from sunup to sundown, even at night if there was enough moonlight to see. And it was work, 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 all hands. Pregnant women would oftentimes be forced to go out and work and pick cotton. Cotton is what you see here, but other crops as well. Children also under brutal conditions, the threat of force and violence if they didn't do the job the way the owner or the overseer wanted them to do, and actual following through on such violence, beatings, whippings, etc., not uncommon at all. There was abuse of slaves after work, sexual abuse of slave women by owners or white people living on the plantation. So this was, needless to say, an extremely difficult life, and this was true to one degree or another everywhere else in the Americas where slavery happened as well. The increasing barbarity under the pushing system. Again, this is specific to America, and in this case, in the decades before the American Civil War. As Edward Baptist says in a fairly recent and riveting but hard to read book about this, hard to read because it is, again, graphic and depressing because of that, but he called the plantation systems, again, this picture painting depicts cotton growing and cultivation, an archipelago of slave labor camps is what we see, a literal organism of economic production. So Baptist sort of sees this as the plantation as like a one sort of living creature, and as a number of its parts, you have slaves who are treated in utterly inhuman fashion in every step of the way. And Baptist, in his book, talks about what was known as the pushing system. He didn't make up that phrase, but it was used then. There was a gigantic growth, say between 1815 at the end of the War of 1812 in this country, the U.S., and the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. So about a 40 to 50 year period. In that time, a huge growth in per capita productivity in cotton product. So productivity went up by sometimes 200, 300%. And what caused that? That kind of productivity increase would lead us to believe, I think most obviously, at least as a guess, would be there must have been some sort of technological advance. Well, there was in 1791, just before this time period, but within our larger time period here. Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, which is a machine that separated the fibrous part of the cotton, the usable part, for as a product to be sold on markets, from the the stems and the stuff that you can't use. It had to be done by hand before that, and now with the machine, it saved labor time by a great amount. So that certainly aided in productivity on the plantations overall, but that happened after the cotton was already picked. So that doesn't explain the gigantic per capita productivity explosion in terms of the amount of cotton taken in per day per person. And I think the main explanation, as Baptist in this book, I think shows quite persuasively, is that it was the pushing system. And it's quite simple and straightforward, though unbelievably harsh. Daily quotas for cotton picking, and brutal physical punishment if the quota was not met. So that if you were a slave and your quota was 50 pounds of cotton for the day, you better come in with 50 pounds or you're going to be beaten, usually whipped. And whippings, I think, are easy to misunderstand, to underappreciate in terms of the violence. A beating with a whip, those whips were so sharp and so brutal that they didn't just leave welts on people's backs. They could cause permanent physical damage and even death. It happened plenty of times. There were sometimes people that died the very first time they were ever whipped. And so this is a common feature of it was one of the major features of the pushing system. Pushing basically meaning we're pushing the slaves to get more creative and get more dexterous with their hands and pick more cotton. Otherwise, they're going to get beaten. And the productivity jump shows that slaves did so. And I would too. I mean, unless I could escape, and people tried that too. But I wouldn't want to get beaten that savagely, any day, let alone every other day or ever many times I didn't, meet the quota. So I would find every way I could to make sure I met the quota. So slaves, so the onus was put on the slaves to become more productive. They weren't given better training in how to, pick cotton more effectively. Again, they weren't given technological devices that did it for them. The owners were saying, in so many words, "You figure it out. You figure out how to get better at this, and you're not going to get any kind of technological help other than what we already have out here." And slaves did figure it out because I don't really think there's any other way that we know of anyway to explain this 200 to 300% productivity per capita growth in the time period we're talking about here, the decades before the Civil War. There was no end to the need for control on slave plantations. Methods of control included, of course, violence and threats of violence. I say of course because we know that's commonplace in conditions of slavery. Retaliation on family for escapes. This, I think, was a very effective means of maintaining control. If you know ahead of time, if you were a slave, the owner or someone that, one of the white people on the property tells you, if you escape, you can be sure that we'll take it out on your family that remains behind for the rest of their lives. Because the whole family isn't escaping. It's not going to happen. You can't take, husband, wife, 3 kids, grandmother, grandfather, cousins. You'll get caught for sure. There's just no way it could happen. So this also explains why there weren't that many escape attempts. White slave owners like to say it's because that our slaves are happy here. They actually tried to make that argument. And you can see it by recognizing how few escapes and escape attempts there are. They don't try to escape because they're happy here, which of course was absurd. And abolitionists or people, the growing number of Americans, particularly in the North, that were against slavery, increasingly so, didn't buy this, and it wasn't true, of course, because the real reason that they weren't escaping is because it was so dangerous, and potentially dangerous even for family members left behind. Another clever method of control, not, of course, a blunt one like violence and threat of violence, was encouraging slaves who were already Christians to go to church services with exclusively white preachers. In that picture, I'm not sure if that's a white preacher intended to be drawn there. I'm not sure. But because slaves sometimes were allowed to go to church services with black preachers, or in many cases, they did so covertly. So to go somewhere on the property at night, or sort of somewhere fairly excluded, where they wouldn't be seen, and practice Christianity, do church services on their own, even though the rules were against it. If they got caught, they get punished, of course, but in many plantations, they did it again and again and again, even after they got caught and punished. But what whites wanted, what the owners of plantations wanted to have happen, was get African Americans to black slaves to go to church, but have a white preacher who would be always preaching an approved sermon, something that preached in the direction of obedience to authority. Of course, that's what they'd want. They'd want the preacher to stay away from, and he would, stories like Moses in Exodus, in the Bible, Old Testament, right? Because Moses led the Hebrew slaves out of slavery, out of captivity, to freedom in the Bible. If you're a white slave owner and you want your slaves to go to church, you don't want that to be a lesson that they learn, though they might already know that one and they might do that one on their own. But you're trying to sort of guide them towards those aspects of religion and faith that benefit you. And it was a dangerous game because you're trying to keep them away from aspects of Christian doctrine and stories from the Bible that wouldn't benefit you, to put it mildly. But it was still tried, sometimes successfully, but not always. By the way, just the fact that there was such need for control, and I only picked out 3 methods of control here, there are many more, shows that, of course, slaves weren't happy. Slave owners were saying it all the time. Our slaves are happy here, and we treat them well. They love it here. They don't want to leave. Right? That's absurd to us, and it was absurd to many at the time. But they argued this at the same time that they're always coming up with new methods for control. If slaves are happy, then why do you need any methods at all to control them? They'll just stay on their own. You wouldn't have to spend so much time thinking about and executing methods of control. Resistance to slavery. There were many forms of resistance. The most severe ones were murder of slave owners. It happened once in a while. Arson, escape, and the biggest one of all, armed rebellion, because it was the most dangerous for everybody involved on both sides. But all of those things happened fairly infrequently. the most common forms of slave resistance were everyday things that you only took a little bit of risk because it wasn't such a a transgression of the rules that you'd get killed or get severely hurt, or at least you were less likely to. So slaves did small things, oftentimes just as a way to maintain their own integrity, their own sort of sense of pride, to kind of as a way to kind of get back at the owners. But things like breaking tools, work stoppages, slowing down their work, stealing, sabotaging, equipment and other things. So that was the most common kind of. Those kind of things happen on an everyday basis. But again, escapes, rebellions. You took much more of a risk because that could be met with a death sentence, and often was met with that. Historians of slavery have had a difficult sort of balancing act to do over the decades because those historians that focus on sort of the how much slaves were controlled and brutalized, which they surely were, then there's less. If you're focusing on that and you're focusing on how much control and violent control in many cases slave owners had over the slaves, utilized over the slaves, then it seems to leave less room for resistance by slaves. Like, how could they resist when they're being beaten all the time? And those historians that have focused more on resistance then have a tougher time sort of explaining, well, then how, if they resisted all these times and so effectively, then how could there have been that much brutal control, by effectively wielded by the slave owning, white people that were in control of plantations. So there is a balancing point there, potentially anyway, but it's not an easy one. That being said, slaves found remarkable ways to resist and remarkable ways to kind of make slavery, at least somewhat less oppressive, and it was very oppressive. So they'd push the envelope as far as they could and to get as many advantages as they could in a life, right, that didn't offer many advantages. But the point is that they didn't just sit back and take it without thinking carefully through what we can and what we can't do to push back a little bit and to carve out at least a tiny bit of our control of our own lives on the plantation. And it may have just been a tiny bit in some cases or most cases, but it does show that slaves were standing up for themselves and cleverly finding ways to carve out at least some space for themselves in an otherwise existence that didn't include freedom for them. Making African-American cultural traditions. There's a section in our text on this, but it talks about things slightly differently than I do here. There's been a lot of historical studies of the culture of slaves, particularly in North America, in the American colonies, and then the states, and then specifically in the southern states. But among those cultural artifacts that have been studied, the three that are studied the most, and they all stand out as very distinctive, was one, a distinctive black Christianity, meaning, again, all slaves were Christians and willing Christians. They wanted to go to church. They believed in God. And you can understand, hopefully, I think you can understand why that church would be such an important thing for them. In a life that's full of suffering and pain and lacking, basically all freedoms, church was one of the few soothing balms that made life bearable, made it livable, one of those kind of spaces they carved out for themselves. Slaves, created their own kind of distinctive forms of Christianity, which to some degree survive today. Also, the black family in slavery has been studied a lot, and slaves had to get creative with family life as well, and did, partially because, as we already know, families were broken up by slave owners. Family members, sold away to some other plantation, maybe in another state, far, far away, never to be seen again. And the desire or demand by whites to keep, black people under control, to keep slaves, fully under their thumb. They didn't allow slaves to do certain things like marry. So the slave marriages weren't recognized by American law. You see a picture, a painting on the left of the, again, distinctive marriage ceremony that became common on plantations. So what we're saying is that slaves still married, but they had to find their own sort of rituals and their own way of doing it, because it wasn't accepted, wasn't recognized by American law, and the plantation owners really didn't want to allow it, period. If they didn't have to, but they oftentimes couldn't control it. Sometimes they allowed it to happen since it wasn't legal based on U.S. standards of law anyway. Folk music and folk literature is another aspect of all of this. Cultural traditions, so a rich sort of cornucopia of music and folk literature, often oral tradition, stories that were handed down from generation to generation. Also, kept morale up and kept slaves with some semblance of normality. These three things here and a few others were things that they could control in a life where by day, when you're working, which was most of the day, you didn't have much or any control at all, right? The slave owner and slave owning class couldn't take your love of God, your love of family, and your love of music and stories from you. That's inside of you. It's in your heart and in your mind. Even if they kill you, that doesn't get taken from you. So you can, see how these things were extremely important to slaves, and something I think very worthwhile to learn about. Also, culture, as you see in the orange or whatever color that is at the bottom, the culture as resistance idea. I put a question mark because I guess it's somewhat open to argument, but I think it's more or less true, and that is that maintaining your own culture proudly, again, Christianity, going to church, spending time with your family, ceremonies like the marriage ceremony, that was a form of resistance in a way, because it allowed you to kind of take pride in your own culture and your own family and your own group, blacks or African Americans in this case, so that you resisted in ways that didn't get you in trouble, or at least didn't get you in that much trouble, because again, holding your own church services was often against the rules, and slaves would do it and sometimes get caught. There'd be some punishment for that, but much of this were things that happened in slave quarters on plantations, after hours, out of the earshot and vision of the slave owners and their family or their white workers. And so, but being able to carve out their own sort of cultural life, even under harsh conditions, allowed them to maintain morale and a sense of pride that I think is rightfully seen as a form of resistance in its own right. It helped to keep them from becoming completely demoralized and totally caving in and losing any sense of sort of the human spirit. And this is what Edward Baptist, in a book I've already quoted once, a recent book, The Half Has Never Been Told, when he says, even as the political trajectory of slavery unfolded, in spaces sacred and secular, during the day and during the night, in pain and in joy, enslaved people were finding new ways to protect and defend the human soul in the midst of the still unfolding chaos of creative destruction. They made survival and form out of terror, theft, and death. So finding new ways to protect and defend, spaces sacred and secular, in pain and in joy, saying they're finding spaces and ways to make life still livable under the harshest of circumstances, but still doing so as a way to hold on, hang on, keep themselves and their families, from collapsing psychologically, or collapsing mentally, collapsing physically, and sort of maintaining as much of a positive attitude as they could. It's remarkably inspiring to see a people, group of people here, and this happens in other times and places in the world too, where people do inspiring things under difficult conditions. But I can't think of more difficult conditions to maintain this kind of, in a sense, positive attitude under. It's just remarkable that any were able to do it at all. I'm not saying there were no slaves that got sort of crushed psychologically and otherwise by slavery and kind of gave up hope, but it's amazing that so many did not.